Welcome back to Churchill's Secret Diary. This is episode 5, and if you've been following this series, you know we've uncovered some incredible secrets about Winston Churchill. But what you're about to hear might be the most heartbreaking entry in his entire diary, because it reveals a family tragedy that haunted Churchill for decades. This diary entry is dated March 1942, and it begins with the most devastating confession any father could write. I have saved Britain from Hitler, but I cannot save my own son from himself. Randolph is destroying everything I've worked to build, and I don't know how to stop him without destroying our relationship forever. Nobody knew that Winston Churchill was fighting 2 wars simultaneously during World War II. While he led Britain against Nazi Germany, he was also waging a desperate private battle to save his eldest son, Randolph, from alcoholism, reckless behavior, and a self-destructive hatred of everything his father represented. Randolph Churchill was everything his father was not: impulsive where Winston was calculating, careless where Winston was meticulous, and bitter where Winston was determined. But most painfully for Churchill, Randolph seemed to take genuine pleasure in embarrassing and undermining his father at the worst possible moments. Churchill's diary reveals the extent of Randolph's destructive behavior during the war. Last night, while I was meeting with Roosevelt's representatives about Lend-Lease aid, Randolph was arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct outside Parliament. The newspapers will have a field day. How do I ask the British people to trust my leadership when I can't even control my own family? The conflict between Churchill and Randolph wasn't just personal, it was ideological. Randolph had inherited his father's intelligence and charisma, but none of his discipline or sense of purpose. Where Churchill saw duty and service, Randolph saw hypocrisy and self-importance. Where Churchill saw noble sacrifice for a greater cause, Randolph saw an old man's ego disguised as patriotism. Churchill's diary records one of their most devastating arguments. Randolph accused me of caring more about my public reputation than about my family. He said, "Father, you're so busy playing the great leader that you've forgotten how to be a human being. You save strangers and ignore the people who actually know you." I couldn't answer him because I was afraid he might be right. The tragedy of the Churchill family conflict was that both father and son were partially correct in their criticisms of each other. Churchill had indeed sacrificed family relationships for political success, often treating his children as accessories to his public image rather than individuals with their own needs and desires. But Randolph had also wasted the privileges and opportunities his father's success had provided, choosing self-destruction over self-improvement. Churchill's most painful diary entry about Randolph was written after his son's worst public embarrassment. Randolph gave an interview to American journalists yesterday, drunk as usual, and told them that his father is a warmongering old fool who's forgotten that wars are fought by young men who die while old men make speeches. The Americans were shocked, but I wasn't. Randolph has been trying to wound me publicly for years, and he's finally found the perfect weapon: the truth about our relationship. What made the situation even more heartbreaking was that Churchill could see his own flaws reflected and magnified in his son. Randolph had inherited Churchill's tendency toward depression, his addictive personality, and his need for constant attention and validation. But where Churchill had channeled these traits into political achievement, Randolph had let them consume his life. Churchill wrote, "Looking at Randolph is like looking into a mirror that shows me who I could have become if I hadn't found politics to give my life meaning. He has all my weaknesses and none of my coping mechanisms. I created this monster by giving him everything except the one thing he needed most: a father who was present and engaged." The war made the father-son conflict even more complicated because it forced them to work together professionally while their personal relationship was falling apart. Randolph was serving as a war correspondent, and his reports often contradicted or undermined his father's official statements about military progress. If you want to know how Churchill tried to save his son and whether their relationship ever recovered, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next reveals the true cost of being a great public leader and a failed private father.
Churchill's attempts to help Randolph only made their relationship worse, because every effort felt like another attempt to control and manipulate rather than understand and support. His diary reveals the painful pattern that developed. Churchill would try to use his political influence to protect Randolph from the consequences of his behavior, which only enabled more destructive choices and created deeper resentment. The breaking point came in June 1942, when Randolph was arrested for assaulting a fellow officer during a drunken argument about military strategy. The incident threatened to become a major scandal that could damage Churchill's wartime leadership at a crucial moment. Churchill's diary reveals his agonizing decision about how to respond. "I could use my position to make this go away, to protect Randolph from court-martial and public disgrace. But doing so would prove everything he's accused me of, that I value my political image more than justice, that I believe my family deserves special treatment, that I'm the hypocrite he says I am. Or I could let him face the consequences of his actions, knowing it might destroy him, but hoping it might also save him." Churchill chose to let Randolph face military justice, and his son never forgave him for it. The court-martial was a humiliating public spectacle that ended with Randolph being demoted and transferred to a remote posting in North Africa. Instead of learning from the experience, Randolph interpreted his father's refusal to intervene as final proof that Churchill cared more about politics than family. Churchill's diary entry after the court-martial is one of the most heartbreaking passages he ever wrote. "Randolph looked at me as they led him away, and his eyes were empty of everything except hatred. I have lost my son to save my principles, and I'm not sure either choice was worth the cost. What kind of man chooses abstract duty over his own child's welfare?" The separation forced Churchill to confront uncomfortable truths about his role as a father. His diary reveals that he had always treated his children as projects to be managed, rather than people to be understood. He had provided them with material advantages and social connections, but had never given them the emotional support and personal attention they needed to develop their own sense of purpose and self-worth. "I realize now that I raised Randolph to be a reflection of my success rather than a person in his own right. I wanted him to be grateful for the opportunities I provided, but I never asked what he actually wanted from life. I expected him to be proud of my achievements, but I never helped him achieve anything of his own. I created a son who exists only in relation to me, and then I'm surprised when he resents that relationship." But Churchill's diary also reveals his growing understanding of Randolph's perspective. His son wasn't just rebelling against his father's authority, he was struggling with the impossible burden of being Winston Churchill's child during Winston Churchill's greatest period of historical importance. Churchill wrote, "How do you build your own identity when your father is saving Western civilization? How do you matter as an individual when everyone sees you only as Winston Churchill's son? How do you rebel against a man who's genuinely doing the right thing for the world, even if he's doing the wrong thing for his family?" This insight led Churchill to one of his most profound realizations about the relationship between public service and private life. His diary reveals that he began to understand that his devotion to duty had made him emotionally unavailable to the people who needed him most, and that his greatest failure wasn't political, it was personal. "I've spent my entire adult life believing that serving the public good justified sacrificing private relationships. But what if I was wrong? What if the kind of person who neglects his own family for strangers isn't actually a noble servant, but just a man who's afraid of intimacy, hiding behind the mask of duty?" The revelation that his son's problems might be symptoms of his own emotional failures as a father forced Churchill to reconsider everything he believed about leadership and responsibility. But his diary reveals that even this self-awareness couldn't immediately repair the damage that had been done to his relationship with Randolph. Subscribe and hit that notification bell to find out whether Churchill and his son ever reconciled,
because what happens next shows the long-term consequences of choosing public greatness over private connection. Churchill's relationship with Randolph reached its lowest point in December 1943, when his son wrote him a letter from North Africa that contained the most brutal assessment of their relationship ever put in writing. Churchill quoted the entire letter in his diary, and it reveals the depth of pain and resentment that had built up over decades of emotional neglect. Randolph wrote, "Dear Father, I'm writing to tell you that I no longer consider myself your son. You are Winston Churchill, the great wartime leader, and I am just another casualty of your success. You have sacrificed everything personal and human in yourself to become a historical figure, and you've sacrificed your family on the same altar. I don't hate you for choosing duty over love, but I hate you for pretending that choice was noble instead of admitting it was selfish." The letter continued with even more devastating accusations. You didn't become a public servant despite your personal flaws. You became a public servant because of them. Politics gave you an excuse to avoid the messy, complicated work of actually connecting with the people closest to you. It's easier to inspire millions of strangers than to understand one difficult son. Churchill's response to this letter reveals how profoundly his son's words affected him. Instead of defending himself or dismissing Randolph's accusations, Churchill spent days analyzing every criticism and forced himself to acknowledge the painful truth behind his son's anger. Randolph is right about almost everything. I did use politics as an escape from the difficulties of family life. I did find it easier to be Winston Churchill, the public figure, than Winston Churchill, the private man. I did sacrifice my children's emotional needs for my own psychological needs, disguising selfishness as service. But Churchill's diary also reveals his growing understanding that the damage to his relationship with Randolph wasn't entirely irreversible. His son's brutal honesty, while painful, had finally forced them to confront the real issues in their relationship instead of dancing around them with polite deflection and mutual resentment. Churchill decided to write his own brutally honest letter to Randolph, and his diary contains the complete text. "My dear son, you are absolutely right about everything you've accused me of, and I'm not going to insult your intelligence by denying it or making excuses. I have been a better father to the British people than I have been to you, and that failure will haunt me for the rest of my life." The letter continued, "But I want you to know that my love for you has never been in question, even when my ability to express that love has been completely inadequate. I may have failed as your father, but you have not failed as my son. Your anger is justified, your resentment is earned, and your pain is real. I take full responsibility for all of it." Churchill's most surprising admission in the letter was his acknowledgement that Randolph's criticisms of his character were actually accurate. "You're right that I used politics to avoid intimacy, that I found public service easier than private connection, that I chose historical importance over human warmth. These aren't noble sacrifices, they're character flaws that I've spent decades pretending were virtues." But Churchill's diary reveals that his honest apology to Randolph was only the beginning of a long process of trying to rebuild their relationship. The war was still raging, Churchill was still Prime Minister, and the practical demands of leadership still limited his ability to prioritize family relationships. The real test of Churchill's newfound self-awareness came when Randolph was wounded in action in early 1944. Churchill's diary reveals his immediate response. "I've been given another chance to be Randolph's father instead of just Winston Churchill's son's father. The question is whether I've learned enough about myself to do better this time." Churchill's handling of Randolph's injury would determine whether their relationship could be salvaged or whether the damage was permanent. His diary reveals the specific choices he made and how they affected both his public responsibilities and his private relationships. Comment below what you think Churchill should have done differently as a father, and don't forget to subscribe for more revealing secrets from his hidden diary. Churchill's response to Randolph's injury marked the turning point in their relationship, because it was the first time Churchill chose his role as a father over his role as prime minister. His diary reveals that when he received news of Randolph's wounding, he immediately canceled a crucial meeting with military commanders and flew to North Africa to be with his son. For the first time in my political career, I made a decision based on what my family needed, rather than what the public expected. My staff was horrified that I would leave London during such a critical period, but I realized that I've spent my entire life making the wrong choice between public duty and private love. If Randolph dies while I'm in a committee meeting, I'll never forgive myself. Churchill's diary describes their reunion in the military hospital. Randolph was unconscious when I arrived, but I sat beside his bed for 18 hours, and when he finally woke up, the first thing he said was, "Father, you came." Not Prime Minister, not Sir, just Father. I realized that was the first time in years he had acknowledged me as his parent, rather than just as a famous stranger who happened to share his name. The experience of nearly losing Randolph forced Churchill to confront the real consequences of his emotional unavailability as a father. His diary reveals his growing understanding that his son's self-destructive behavior wasn't just rebellion against authority. It was a desperate attempt to get his father's genuine attention and concern. Randolph has been trying to force me to choose between my public image and my private love for him. His scandals, his drinking, his embarrassing public statements, they weren't attacks on my political career. They were requests for me to prove that he mattered more to me than my reputation. I kept failing the test because I didn't understand what he was really asking for. Churchill's diary also reveals how his changed approach to fatherhood affected his effectiveness as a wartime leader. Instead of making him weaker or more distracted, his increased emotional honesty with his family actually made him more authentic and compelling in his public role. Learning to be vulnerable with Randolph has taught me to be more genuine with everyone. My speeches are more powerful now because they come from a place of real human understanding rather than calculated political rhetoric. You can't inspire others to make sacrifices for love if you've never made sacrifices for love yourself. The reconciliation between Churchill and Randolph wasn't immediate or complete, but Churchill's diary reveals that their relationship gradually improved as both men learned to be more honest about their needs and limitations. Randolph began to understand the genuine weight of his father's responsibilities, while Churchill began to understand the genuine pain of his son's emotional abandonment. Churchill's most insightful diary entry about their relationship was written in 1945, just after VE Day. Randolph and I will never have the easy, natural relationship that some fathers and sons enjoy. Too much damage has been done, too many years have been lost. But we have something that might be more valuable, a relationship based on truth rather than expectation, acceptance rather than approval, love rather than performance. The lesson Churchill learned from his conflict with Randolph influenced his approach to leadership for the rest of his career. His diary reveals that he began to understand that the greatest leaders aren't those who sacrifice everything personal for public service, but those who bring their full humanity to their public roles. I used to think that being a great leader meant suppressing your personal needs and emotions in service of larger causes. But I've learned that being a great leader means integrating your personal experiences into your public wisdom. My failures as a father taught me things about human nature that made me more effective as a politician. Churchill's final diary entry about Randolph, written shortly before his own death, reveals the lasting impact of their reconciliation. Randolph and I will never have the easy, natural relationship that some fathers and sons enjoy. Too much damage has been done, too many years have been lost. But we have something that might be more valuable, a relationship based on truth rather than expectation, acceptance rather than approval, love rather than performance. The war between Churchill and his son taught them both that the most important battles aren't always fought against external enemies. They're fought within families, within relationships, within the human heart. Churchill saved Britain from Hitler, but his greatest victory might have been learning to save his relationship with Randolph from himself. That's the end of episode 5 of Churchill's Secret Diary. What do you think about Churchill's struggle to balance public duty and private relationships? Should great leaders sacrifice family for service, or find ways to honor both? Let me know in the comments below. If you're enjoying these secrets from Churchill's hidden diary, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Next episode, we'll uncover the 3 hours Churchill thought he lost World War II, a story of miscommunication and near disaster that almost changed the course of history. Which episode from Churchill's diary do you want to hear next? Comment your choice. And don't forget to like this video if you're learning something new about the human side of Winston Churchill.